So up next, we have the much anticipated vapor intrusion panel. We have Chris Gosnack, who is a project manager with the Site Assessment Unit of the MPCA's Site Response and Redevelopment section. At the MPCA, Chris assists with the section's Soil Vapor Look-Back project and is a member of the Soil Vapor Specialist team. When not working, Chris enjoys going on walks with his corgi lab mix climbing, curling, and cycling. We have Caitlin Overson. She is a project engineer with Geosyntech Consultants. She applies her civil engineering background to a wide range of services, including due diligence, environmental investigative services, remedial design, vapor intrusion, and brownfield redevelopment services. Virtually, we have Brianna Kirby. She is currently the environmental risk manager with Bremer Bank. She has been with Bremer for 5 years and is a graduate of the University of Minnesota Twin Cities with a degree in environmental science, policy, and management, and a minor in forest ecosystem management and conservation. I'm going to hand the mics over to all of you here virtually, and hopefully we'll be able to hear Brianna, fingers crossed.
Okay, great. Yeah, so just a quick little MPCA view of vapor intrusion. You know, obviously not much has happened over the past year. We rolled out our new BMP and some minor updates to our investigation BMP, but in a large way, I think that kind of the growing pains of vapor intrusion are hopefully in the rearview mirror for us, and we're just kind of working through these issues on a site-by-site basis. So I'm really here just for some Q&A, but on a high level, I think that, you know, again, we have some new mitigation approaches that we've been working through. Gone are the days of completed pathway evaluation, so that was the PRD door air subslab sampling. And we don't do that as a mitigation approach anymore. We can certainly entertain it on short term and dealing with exposure issues, but not really the long-term mitigation approach. Also, you might have noticed we're now updating the ISVs kind of on an annual basis, and the point of that is to kind of, again, look at the data, look at the health risks in consultation with the Department of Health to just make sure that these values are up to date and are actually representative of potential risks. So we kind of target that roll up to be every January or so, and kind of take a look at it towards the end of the year and roll it out in January. And again, you know, notably the benzene ISV got considerably lower, so now we're noticing there's some mitigation with benzene as a contaminant concern. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, I think moving forward, as we'll hopefully discuss in the Q&A, our next stage is tackling the long-term O&M and figuring out how do we decommission these systems. That's a big question that we have started to answer on a few sites here and there and are more than willing to take on, but we really want to provide that guidance in that document. So ultimately, we'll have to reconvene the stakeholder group and kind of go through the same process that we did for the mitigation. That's all I have. I want to save time for Q&A, and we'll run late. So here you go.
All right, so I will try to be quick as well from the user's perspective of vapor intrusion. I reached out to a lot of consultants and users, developers, with how the BMP is going for everyone. And for the most part, I think there's kind of two points to get across from how well is the new BMP going. And the first one is the new BMP is creating consistency between consultants and regulators. It's giving us an ability to tell our clients what are the next steps, being able to predict how the development project is going to go, how remediation is going to go. And it also creates a little bit of flexibility with the new technologies and the new approaches, being able to with subslab depressurization, subslab ventilation, the building pressure modifications, as well as parking garages. Even though I think depressurization is still the predominant mitigation approach, I think we're starting to see projects with ventilation as well as with parking garages being approved by the MPCA and being implemented. And I think that's going to take a couple of years to settle in and get to a good approach and good methods to apply that. But overall, I think it's easy. I would call it predictable. It's easy to talk to your clients about it. One kind of downside to how structured the BMP is it doesn't help with new technologies that are coming in and giving flexibility with maybe larger complex projects. And not saying the MPCA isn't willing to work with us on it, but it can be just with how prescriptive it is, it can sometimes be hard to work with those boundaries for that. And then the second thing, I think Chris touched on it as well, is there's been a huge push for the long-term O&M and also decommissioning. With how quick development projects are moving these days and how fast we want to get buildings up and mitigation systems that are preemptively going in, you'll want to see if the source is removed during redevelopment. Decommissioning those systems is going to be having a little bit more structure around that will be a big need for. Those are kind of my things. Brianna, are you online?
I am here, yep.
All right.
Yes, it's a little bit quiet, but. All right. So I'm Brianna Kirby. I work at Bremer Bank as their environmental risk manager. And so I think the main thing with vapors is it's important to remember that each bank is going to handle risks so differently depending on how much they can loan, how big their appetite is for risk, and vapors definitely pose a risk to a property that we're lending on. But I think when it comes to Bremer, we want to eliminate as many unknowns as possible. So for us, getting those letters and making sure the building is mitigated is really crucial for us, and probably the best place to be in as a customer, because we're more than likely going to close right away. If there's a lot of unknowns that are out there, it's going to take some time to continue getting those samples. We may have to come up with a creative idea on our side, on the credit side, to maybe adjust that LTV, set up an escrow account if we think the credit's strong. That allows us for more time to make sure that building gets mitigated while also closing the loan. We can also get our letters too once those come in and the customer sends them our way. But yeah, all in all, the Vapor BMP for us has been super helpful. We can pull that up when we talk to our lenders or our customers. And yeah, just working with the MPCA closely, working with our consultants really closely has been super helpful, especially when the vapor situation gets really complex on a lot of properties. We really rely on our consultants and the MPCA. So with that, that's kind of where we are at Bremer.
Excellent, thank you. We do have some questions for our panel to get us started. And of course, if you have any questions regarding vapor intrusion for our panelists, please let me know, raise your hand at any time. Or if you are virtual, please put your question in the Q&A section down at the bottom or top of your screen. To get us started, what are your experiences utilizing new mitigation approaches for either all three of you?
As I mentioned, from the consultant perspective, I think subslab depressurization is the predominant mitigation approach. But I have heard, for me personally, on the projects I've worked on since BFP has come out, depressurization has been the option selected, either because it's a retrofit system or because the client is more comfortable with mitigation technology. But I have heard, I know Bonnie and Chuck, when I was talking with them, they're working through a parking garage mitigation. They're trying to work through the kinks and getting them approved. I'm not sure if that project's been approved yet or not. But as of right now, I think it's been a slow start. I think people are a little nervous to have an untested kind of process and approach, but overall, I think it'll be beneficial.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. Obviously we have several approved methods in the PNT, but we're always open to new technologies. One that I'm really excited about is crawl space venting, for example, especially with residential mitigation. It's not always feasible to actually seal crawl space. So please feel free to reach out to myself or other members of the vapor team or the project manager if you think that a new technology might help you. We can work through that process. It might be a little unconventional, and really it comes down to how do we feel confident in the verification phase of it. But I kind of piloted a couple of crawl space sites so far, and kind of might be the hill that I'll die on to get that into the next version of BMP. So yeah.
Is there your friend besides the BMP?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I can't commit to it right now, but I certainly want to. Again, I think it makes a lot of sense, and ITRC has a great document right now online for vapor mitigation, and that's one of their techniques, and they kind of outline when to use it, when not to, and potential verification types. And so it's just kind of rolling that into our own guidance and again, getting some data to show this is effective and we can feel confident long term.
And I'll kind of add to that too. I think from the banking standpoint, new technologies are great, especially if they're efficient and cost effective. So like if we're using parking garages to mitigate or even a passive system when building from the ground up, we're all for it, especially if it's going to protect us in the future. So that's where we kind of see it from the bank.
Great, thank you all. Another question. What is the current status of decommissioning and long-term O&M of mitigation systems?
Yeah, again, the current status is on our radar. I think through this group and others, we see the need to really get this to the forefront, and we need to get more leadership. Honestly, BI is kind of taking a backseat to PFAS lately with all of our agency resources, but nevertheless, BI is one of the primary drivers at the vast majority of our sites. So, long story short, yeah, we can certainly engage in the decommissioning conversation at any site, but I think that conversation really begins with why was the mitigation system installed in the first place, and why don't we need it anymore? If there hasn't been any remedial activity, then probably going to be an uphill battle to decommission that system. And again, that can kind of create further complications if you preemptively mitigate a building and it wasn't completely done per the BMP. Well, then now what are we going to do with this system? We need to understand the source. We understand why the vapor system there to begin with, and we also need to understand that SSD and any of these other mitigation approaches really aren't remediation; they're just mitigation. Unless we have an SDE or some sort of actual removal activity, it's going to be pretty difficult to decommission these systems. So again, communicating that with stakeholders is very important, and we want to have that BMP at some point in the future. And I think, again, if we can show the need that this has to happen yesterday, then let's do it.
Thank you, Chris. This is a question for Brianna. How do lenders handle sites where vapor intrusion data is limited or the outlook appears murky?
So yeah, that's kind of a tricky question. I mean, it really kind of depends on the credit strength, depends on the property type, how much the remediation will cost. If we have limited info and we don't really have a cost for the remediation or mitigation, it's kind of hard to come up with an escrow amount. I have seen instances where we do get an estimate. We can set up like an escrow, adjust LTV, work with our senior credit directors so that we kind of have a plan for closing, and then, getting those letters after we close or mitigating after we close, like that. We just have to get creative. There are instances though where the loan structure may be related to SBA. And that's where, the SBA across the board, they want those letters before there's any type of closure. And then we've seen instances, SBA, they want an updated phase 1 within a year. So if we get drug out for a couple of years, we may be getting a couple of phase 1s for those SBA deals. So yeah, I mean, I think SBA is where it gets fairly complex and takes more time because there are just more like requirements than if it were to be like a conventional loan through the bank where we can get more creative. So yeah, that's kind of where we stand. Just more so just getting creative on how we're going to handle that risk.
Great, thank you. And then there's a follow-up question. Are there scenarios where preemptive mitigation makes sense?
So like putting the mitigation system in beforehand. Is that what the question is referring to?
Yeah, I think it's just kind of like an open-ended question. I think in some cases, preemptive mitigation might make sense. It might be a good strategy. My default position is usually to advocate against it. The BMP is pretty prescriptive of, again, defining the VI-AOC, why is this system installed in the first place, having a site conceptual model that supports that. And in some cases, we're to preemptively mitigate, for example, if you're in an area-wide plume and you know that there's groundwater source and you say, let's just put in a system, that might ultimately be the right call. The mitigation decision is probably going to be mitigate, but without that initial data set, it might actually lead to further complications down the road, particularly when it comes to decommissioning. So we as the agency kind of view that initial data set as really important to evaluate what are those initial starting conditions, and when we get to decommissioning, if we are trying to measure rebound, for example, and other considerations, it's pretty hard to do that if we didn't know what it was before the system was installed. So my 2 cents, and again, I think that preemptive mitigation might have some place, but I would also just encourage you to reach out to the project managers or the team to just say, hey, this is we're on a quick turnaround for a deal or whatever, and we're in an area wide, all but certain, well, then maybe you only collect 1 or 2 samples, not the full NC, for example, but still get some data to support that mitigation decision.
Yeah, and I think in those situations where we know there's like a Superfund plume or something like that, obviously we'd want to go in and put that system in right away, maybe without data, but it's also about getting the customer on board and if they want to pay for that. So it's very rare where we go in and we're requiring that mitigation system right away without any data. I know with our consultants, we're usually doing the 2 rounds just to see what's out there and if our building is impacted. And then we have that discussion with the customer about mitigating. But yeah, I would say it's pretty rare that we do any preemptive mitigation before any data is collected.
Great, thank you. I have another question here for the NPCA, so for Chris. If you could explain the use of indoor air / subslab data for performance verification.
Yeah, this one comes up again and again. I think it's worth revisiting. Some consultants and contractors think, hey, there's no use for a subslab sample in a verification of an SSD sample process. So again, it's a little technical, but I kind of flip that question on its edge and say, whatever. If we're ever collecting an indoor air sample, we pretty much need a subslab sample to evaluate where is this coming from. Is this a completed pathway? Is this an indoor air source? And yes, the argument can be made that if the indoor air is fine, then you're good to go. But again, the BMP has to kind of be consistently applied and has to be universally accepted. So I don't think that we're willing to just say only indoor air is good enough to verify the system. Again, the way that we verify SSDs is through PFE measurements and through the paired indoor air and subslab samples. Now, that's not to say that we have to collect the same number of samples that Appendix C dictates. If it's a large building and you define your BIAOC and you have a partial and you have a good understanding of your sources and everything like that, then yeah, we can work with you to pare down that number of indoor air samples on a number of subslab samples. But in our opinion, and it doesn't seem like it's going to change anytime soon, indoor air needs subslab for verification, and that's going to be that way for a while.
Great. Thank you. That's kind of the list of my questions there. We have a question.
For MPCA, can you talk a little bit more about the VI look-back program, the process, the timeline, and I guess what's your strategy for doing that?
So the question for those of us who are virtual, not myself included, was the VI look back program through the MPCA. So I will have Chris Gosnack answer that.
Yeah, I think that's a presentation on itself. But long story short, we are in site assessment and Superfund fortunate to have some dedicated funding to look at these sites. So sites that were closed prior to our rollout of vapor intrusion, to take a look at it, and what that involves reviewing the actual original file, release file, making a determination whether or not sampling is recommended, and then from there, carrying that out. So it's a pretty big undertaking. We have in our list approximately 1,800 sites or so, depending on how you count the site. And we work closely with the Volunteer Investigation and Cleanup Unit, because a lot of those sites are big sites originally. And again, kind of establishing those relationships with nearby property owners and the source property owners is really what I do day to day. Saying, hey, we didn't necessarily miss this 20 years ago, just we never had these samples, and now we kind of need this additional data. So yeah, it's really exciting, and we have, we're kind of in the first 2 years of this project, and are definitely getting to the team, and look forward to probably doing a presentation shortly on it, and would love to take questions more directly on it. I can answer from that too.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from the audience or our virtual audience? We have a question from Marcus, and I'll repeat the question so that the virtual people can hear.
So on the topic of decommissioning, I'm wondering if the post-construction sampling is being set up in a way that it's easy to tell, test rather, if a site's ready.
Yeah, so Marcus was asking about a post-construction sampling enables, or is there a way to have it kind of set up and decommissioning down the road? Is that correct, Marcus? Yeah, so I think a couple things come to mind just off the top of my head. Number one, decommissioning is not only a soil vapor evaluation. Decommissioning needs to take account for the whole release. So again, if you have a groundwater flow and yeah, your vapor data is going to look favorable as an SSD system continues to operate, but if there's still groundwater flowing, you still need a mitigation system, and part of that is ultimately shutting it off and measuring that rebound and going from there. And that's why I say, it really begins with what is the release, what is the source, and how has that changed since the system was installed? If we can't answer those basic questions, then I don't think we can really get a decommissioning just yet. So that's why I think there are certain sites where it makes a lot of sense, especially the large Superfund sites where we are actively remediating things, actually from source removal. But if we're just kind of tangentially on a groundwater plume that's just sitting there, it's probably going to be an uphill battle to ultimately decommission that system. But to your point, Marcus, I think that our post-construction verification sampling data is certainly going to be part of that. We need to know what are the conditions when we first install the system, what are the conditions before we install the system, and what are the conditions after we decommission it. So that's really what we're looking at.
Okay, I think I will allow time for one more question, if anybody has one. Mary?
Is that going to be based on data or on what is the basis of that?
Yeah, great question. So Mary was asking about the ISV review on an annual basis. So full disclosure, I'm not doing it. I'm not smart to do that. That's the health risk assessors at the Department of Health and other divisions in the PCA. So two things. A, we're not going to look at every single compound every single year. That's kind of an undertaking that would be a little too much. But I think we are going to look at, hey, there's new data out there. What is on health's radar? Does that apply to our ISVs? For example, the benzene level was dropped ultimately because the HRL was dropped, and how those studies influence the underlying assumptions of the ISVs. I don't fully understand it in full disclosure, but the point again is to have these be relevant, the values that we stand by, and kind of know that we made the right decision. So with that potentially comes some headaches. Again, look back projects and figuring out, well, the data was 20 and now it's 5. What do we do? Long story short, I think that's just another reason to use Equus and other environmental databases, so you can pull that information in right away and know that we didn't miss anything.
All right, I want to have everyone give a lovely round of applause to our vapor intrusion.